After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. He said, Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy, or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. This is the Lord's word for us today. You may be seated.
What do you love more than anything else in the entire world? I don't mean your favorite sports team or your favorite topping of pizza. What do you cherish more than anything else? Family. For many of us, that's the first answer. We cherish our family. If you're a parent, you cherish your child. The story brings a whole new level of significance and weight to me in my first year as a father. This year, to say, man, what in the world? Some of us, it's a spouse. We cannot imagine not being with them. The peace and the stability that they bring to our lives. For some of us, it might be a dream or a goal that we have for our life. It's the North Star of your life. As long as I am heading in this direction, as long as I'm making progress in my career or towards that dream that I have for my life, then I will finally be happy. For many of us, it's our health. We could not imagine not having our health and the ability to do the things that we can do right now. If we were to suffer a debilitating condition, we could not imagine going on any further. For some of us, it's our career and the accolades and the success that we get from our coworkers and our boss and whoever looking at us as if we're successful and we have things together. For some of us, if we're honest, it's our phone. We could not imagine being without our phone. And the moment that it's lost, we feel lost in and of ourselves. What if God asked you to give up that thing that you cherish more than anything else with no explanation and no reason behind it, just simply to do it? That's the question that this story poses for us, this daunting question. What if God asked me to give up everything with no reason or no explanation on the other side? Open up your Bibles, if you haven't yet, to Genesis chapter 22. If you're new to the Bible, Genesis is the first book of the Bible. We're only 22 chapters in. And this is the question that Abraham faces in this story. This is one of the most famous stories, especially in the Old Testament, maybe the entire Bible. And so even opening up this story and reading it, there is a weight to this story. This story is probably one of the most well-known stories in the whole of the Bible. And not only does it ask this daunting question of what if God asked me to give up everything, but most scholars, ancient Near Eastern scholars, see this as a story that is masterfully told. Every word in this story matters. It is a thoughtful reflection and consideration of what is God doing and what would it mean to trust him with everything. Over the past few weeks to this series, Wilder Faith, we've been following the biography of Abraham, this man of faith. The Bible looks to him as the prototype or the example of what it means to have faith in God. And we've been using this map of sorts to describe the journey of faith. That all of us, as we learn to trust God, we are on a journey of learning to trust him completely. We begin early in this stage with what we call awakening, which is where we begin to become aware of God and aware of ourselves in light of that. In some traditions, we call this conversion, or when I prayed a prayer and accepted Jesus as my Lord and Savior. This is the beginning of the journey of faith. We saw that in Abraham in chapter 12 and in chapter 15. That then leads us to a stage that's called purgation, where God begins to refine us and make us who he wants us to be. We put things off, old ways and old sinful things, and we put on the way of Jesus and the character of Jesus and the things that he cares about. On the next stage is then illumination, and this is Abraham's illumination moment, where he finally sees who God is and what God is all about. But on this journey, there's actually in this story a test that happens at the end of the purgation stage and into the illumination stage. What we might use this red wall, that there's something that happens that is actually common for those who walk the journey of faith, but that is often hard for us to talk about. We'll see in Genesis 22, as you look at the story of Abraham here, if you remember in chapter 12, if you were with us at the beginning of his journey of faith, God came to him and he said, I want you to go, I want you to leave your country, your household, and your father, and I want you to go to a land that I will show you. Notice in chapter 22, verse 2, what God says. I want you to take your son, your only son, whom you love, and go to the mountain that I will tell you. You see, there is a bookending of Abraham's story that's happening here. In chapter 12, God came to him and said, I want you to leave. In chapter 22, he comes to him and he says, I want you to give. There's something that's coming to a conclusion in Abraham's story here, a final test of sorts that will show us what's actually going on in Abraham's heart at this point. So look at chapter 22, verse 1. It says, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here am I. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So notice it says, after some time. If you were to go to the previous chapter, we would learn a couple of really important things have happened in Abraham's journey. In chapter 21, Isaac is born. Isaac is the child that he and his wife Sarah have been longing for, hoping for. God promised to them for over 25 years. That child has finally come. And so imagine the joy and the relief and the celebration that they have in chapter 21 as finally these promises have come true. Not only that, but in chapter 21, Ishmael, which was Abraham's child that he manufactured on his own strategy and his own plan, is sent away with Hagar. God takes care of them. And so for the first time in Abraham's journey, he finally has many of the things that God promised him. He finally has a sense of stability, a sense of God came through for me. I have the child. I have the promise. You see, what tends to happen in the journey of faith as we follow God over the course of several years or even a decade or so, is we begin to get our bearings. Like we begin to kind of figure out, okay, this is how I follow Jesus. Right? We don't struggle with the same gravity of sin as we once did. Right? We don't ever really overcome sin and temptation entirely, but we learn, okay, I've learned to put off some old things. I've now put on the way of Jesus. And so I don't struggle with the same big things that I used to. I now have a sense of how to follow Jesus. We maybe have gotten a handle of how to read the Bible, or at least how to make sense of most of the Bible. We figured out, okay, this is how to live in community, and we maybe have a rule of life or a plan for following Jesus. And we've learned how to pray, and we're engaged in a church, and we're connected. And for the most part, we get to this stage in our journey of faith where things are going pretty well. We don't struggle as much as we did. We're kind of doing the faith thing. That happens for many of us after maybe a couple years, or maybe you're a quick learner and it comes pretty quickly to you. That's where Abraham is. Things are going pretty well for him. But notice what happens. After these things, God tested Abraham. Notice that this testing is from God. God brings this on him to draw something out of him. You see, we tend to think that the testing of our faith, we oftentimes think it's an external thing. I go through difficult circumstances, and so I'm being tested. And I go through maybe a trial or a temptation or a period of struggle, and it's a testing that's happening in my life. And that is the case in much of our life. But notice that this testing is from God. This is not a testing that comes from my circumstances, but rather something that God brings upon me to refine me. Oftentimes in my testing, when I'm going through difficult circumstances, I look to God. I rely on God. I say, God, would you get me through this difficult circumstance? Would you get me through this trial or this struggle? And so God becomes a relief or a source of comfort or hope or encouragement. In this stage, God is not that, at least not in my experience, because God's the one who's bringing this testing on me. God's the one who's bringing this season of difficulty on me. James 1, verses 2 and 4 says this, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." You see, you said this all along, that faith is a lifelong journey of learning to trust God completely. And so what happens at this stage in the journey is God tests us in order to draw out of us a perseverance or a willingness to go through difficulty and to trust in who he is so that we might be made complete, that we might lack nothing. And so God tests us. He tests Abraham here. And what is that experience like? It might be an experience of darkness or discouragement or confusion. If you look at verse 3, Abraham, he gets up early. He's doing what God tells him to do. He saddles his donkey, he gets his men around him, and then he cuts the wood. Some commentators have noted that's a strange way to pack your bags. All right, he's got the whole thing, and then he forgot the very things that he needs in order to sacrifice his son Isaac. There's some confusion and even some difficulty that Abraham has. He's willing to do it, but he's also confused. Because after all, this is the child of the promise. So you see, oftentimes in our journey of faith, we encounter a season of dryness or difficulty, or it just feels like God's maybe distant, or he's not answering my prayers. And so it can be a really confusing time. But what we find through the story of faith, through the story of Abraham, and through the story of others who have followed the way of Jesus, is this is actually a really common experience for many people. That you walk the journey of faith for a couple years, or maybe a couple decades, and then you hit this wall of sorts, where it just feels like it's not the same thing that I used to have. It feels dry, or confusing, or dark. And we don't often talk about it in church because it's hard to talk about. How do you talk about it? Like, hey, it feels like God's abandoned me. It feels like God's really distant right now. Oftentimes what we say is, well, what have you done wrong? How have you sinned? How have you failed? Like, let's look at you. But notice this testing all along is something that God brings to us. This is a stage of the journey of faith where God is doing some of his most important work in us, but it is also a time that is very often confusing and difficult. In some Christian traditions, this experience is called the dark night of the soul. Or Pete Scazzero, in his book Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, calls it the wall. We hit this point where I don't know what God is doing. I don't feel his closeness. I don't feel his comfort like I used to. Abraham had experienced the comfort and the promises of God in his son Isaac, but now it seems like that's all up for grabs. It's not a trial of my circumstances, but rather it is a testing where I am learning something new about God, or God is doing a new thing in me. Pete Scazzero puts it this way in his book, "At the wall, our good feelings of God's presence evaporate. We feel the door of heaven has been shut as we pray. Darkness, helplessness, weariness, a sense of failure or defeat, barrenness, emptiness, dryness all descend upon us. We can't see what God is doing, and we see little visible fruit in our lives." This is a daunting stage in the journey of faith. But the central question that God is asking Abraham, the central question that he asks us when we find ourselves in a season like this, is will I trust God with everything, even if it means giving up everything? Will I trust God with everything, even if it means giving up the very things that God promised me? even if it means giving up the child of the promise, even if it means that I don't feel close to God, or even if it means, honestly, God is really confusing in this season of life, will I trust him anyways? You see, what God is doing at this stage is he is refining our love. He is refining our desire so that we would desire him and only him. You'll notice who he is supposed to sacrifice. He says in verse 2, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love. That in itself is the story of Abraham. He did not have a son when God called him. And then he longed for a son, and this is the son of the promise. And Abraham has learned to love this son, to care for this son, to desire this son as a sign that God was in fact working. In fact, Thomas Mann, a commentator on this text, he said this: the test is one of obedience and trust. In essence, it's a test of Abraham's relationship with God. It asks whether Abraham's trust is really in God and not simply in what God has promised. Abraham has built altars before and sacrificed to this God when God renewed the promises. Is he willing now to build an altar and sacrifice the promises themselves embodied in his son in order to demonstrate his unswerving trust in the God who stands behind the promises? Is my trust in the God in God's provision or in God? That is the test of this stage. You'll notice in the story, the writer wants you to feel Abraham's agony. He wants you, like Abraham is not callous toward his son in this story. Every time Isaac, his son, is mentioned, it includes the phrase, my son. In fact, 18 times in just 14 verses, my son appears. It is clear that the writer wants you to know Abraham loves his son. In fact, we see this in the central turning point of the story in verse 6. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. You see, a burnt offering was a complete sacrifice. When God asks him, he's not saying this is a symbolic thing. This is a real thing. A burnt offering, you would slaughter the animal. You would cut it up into pieces. You would put it on the altar. You would light that altar on fire until there was nothing left but ash. This is the test. And notice what he says. So they went, both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, my father. And he said, here I am, my son, father and son. And he said, behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they both of them went together. See, the writer is not callous towards this situation. In fact, he wants to draw you in to understand that what is happening here is the hardest thing that Abraham has ever had to do. See, the story of Abraham so far has been him wrestling with this very question: will the Lord provide? All along throughout his story, he's been trying to help God and to assist God and to offer his strategy and his plan for God's plan for his life. But here, everything is on the line. He has nothing to do. There's nothing that he can do to help God in this situation. He instead has to trust God completely. And the story, notice how the story slows down in verse 9. They came to the place. Abraham built the altar and laid the wood and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar. The writer is drawing out every moment of Abraham's agony. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. He's going to do it. He doesn't understand it. He's going to do it. You see, the question is, will I trust God? Not only with what he gives, but also with what he takes away. As Job said at the beginning of his dark night of the soul, naked I came into this world, and naked I will leave. The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Can you say that? The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. Either way, he's good. That is the challenge of this stage. And so what God has to do in us at this stage of the journey of faith is he has to draw out of us the deep affections and attachments and idols that we have still residing deep in our hearts and deep in our lives. At this stage, God is not confronting the sin in our lives, but rather he is confronting the good things in our lives that we make ultimate things. The good things that he brings to us that are good for us to have, are good for us to enjoy, but they become idols or attachments that are greater than or more important than God in our lives. Tim Keller put it this way: we think that idols are bad things, but that is almost never the case. The greater the good, the more likely we are to expect that it can satisfy our deepest needs and hopes. Anything can serve as a counterfeit God, especially the very best things in life. This is not about challenging sin, the bad things that I do, but the good things that become ultimate things. Gerald May is a Christian psychologist and an expert in the dark night of the soul, and in his book, he describes this as attachments. That in our life, we become attached to certain things and certain people and certain relationships for a sense of well-being. Here's what he says. This is a little bit long, but I think it helps. Each of us has countless attachments. We are attached to our daily routines, our environments, our relationships, and of course, our possessions. We are also attached to our religious beliefs and to our images of ourselves, others, and God. Attachments are inevitable. In a spiritual sense, the objects of our attachments and addictions become idols. We give them our time, energy, and attention, whether we want to or not, even and often especially when we are struggling to rid ourselves of them. We want to be free, compassionate, and happy, but in fact, in our attachments, we are clinging, grasping, and fearfully self-absorbed. We cannot liberate ourselves. Our defenses and our resistances will not permit it, and we can hurt ourselves in the attempt. To guide us toward the love we most desire, we must be taken where we could not and would not go on our own. Unless we sabotage the journey, we must not know where we are going. Deep in the darkness, way beneath our senses, God instills another better love and more deeper, urgent longings. See, what he's saying is God leads us through a season of dryness or confusion or darkness or difficulty to draw out of us our sense in which we trust in the good things that God gives us rather than God himself. That the good blessings like Isaac is to Abraham, God gave it to him. He's the child of the promise. He is the one that God gave him in his life. And yet that becomes this idol or this attachment, this thing that he cares for and clings to, as this is the sign that the promises will come true. Isaac, when who is it that actually brings the promises to bear? It's God. This is why you see in verse 2, he says, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and offer him in the land of Moriah. But look at what happens in verse 12. Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Notice what's changed in how Isaac is described. He's still his son. He's still his only son. But the degree of love that he has for Isaac is different now. Because now he loves God more than he loves Isaac. It's not that he doesn't love Isaac or shouldn't love Isaac. The rest of the story tells us that he does. But there is a change that happens when he learns to trust God as the one who brings the promises about and not Isaac. You see, this has to happen in us as well. Our most deeply rooted attachments and idols are often the good things that God brings to us, rather than in God himself. It's a child that we cling to, that we love and we should love, but they become the source of our happiness and our security and our success. It's a spouse or a relationship that we cling to, that we hold on to say, as long as I'm with someone, as long as I'm with them, as long as they love me, then I am secure. It's even our sense of community. As long as people in church love me, then God is good to me. As long as I don't go through difficulty, then God is good for me. As long as he provides for me, then God is good for me. It is putting the blessings of God and the benefits of God above God himself. And this is spiritual idolatry. In fact, in this stage of the journey, even our ideas of God and our feelings for God can become idols. Gerald May put it this way: we easily become so attached to feelings of and about God that we equate them with God. We forget that these are sensations that are only speaking to us of the divine one. They are only messengers. Instead, we take them for the whole of God's self, and thus we wind up worshiping our own feelings. This is perhaps the most common idolatry in the spiritual life. That I equate the closeness of God with how I feel. Do I feel inspired? Do I feel encouraged? Do I feel helped? Do I feel supported? Do I feel the blessings of God? And if we're not careful, we equate those feelings with God himself. And so I worship God as long as he brings me happiness or inspiration or encouragement, as long as he makes sense to me. I worship God as long as he fits into my thinking and my beliefs and my priorities, rather than worshiping him as God. And you see, this is super easy to do because we live in a consumeristic, self-help, individualistic world. And so I look around and say, does this work for me? Does this make me happy? Does this fit my agenda and my desire and my plans for my life? Does this make me feel good about myself? And if we're not careful, we confuse the benefits of God for God himself. And say, I will only worship God if he makes me feel good. I'll only have faith if it's clear what God is doing in my life. And then we encounter this season of difficulty or discouragement, and we walk away and say, this God thing must not work. St. John of the Cross, who was the first one to write The Dark Night of the Soul, said this: many praise and bless Jesus as long as they receive some consolation from him. But if he hide himself and leave them for a little while, they fall either into complaining or into excessive dejection. Is that where you are today? I don't feel God's closeness. I don't feel the happiness or the joy of God. It might be that you're in this stage and God is drawing something deeper out of you. You see, it is only when I surrender everything to God that I will see God clearly. It is only when I allow him to become all that I have that I will learn that he is all that I need. And so I have to go through a season like this in my journey of faith to be weaned off of my reliance on my emotions and my feelings and the blessings so that I can learn to trust God as God, regardless of my circumstances, regardless of my situation, regardless of what I am going through. God is God and I am not. And so I have to learn to trust him. And how am I going to learn at this deep level is only if God withdraws. And here's what I mean by withdraws. I mean, God doesn't withdraw his presence from us, but he withdraws the felt sense of his presence. He becomes a little confusing, or my prayers feel like they're hitting the ceiling, or worship doesn't quite feel as inspiring or encouraging as it was before. I experience some spiritual dryness. And what's often happening at this stage of the journey is God is weaning us off of our need to rely on our emotions. If you think about a child who goes through a weaning process. We're not there yet in our journey of parenting, right? But the experience of weaning, right? What the mother has to do is she has to withdraw from her child. And the child doesn't understand it. It feels cruel. It feels like mom has abandoned me. It feels like she's not providing for me. I don't feel the closeness or the connection or the intimacy that I once did with my mother. But what that mother is doing is that mother is loving that child. But the experience is of coldness or withdrawal. But if she does not do that, that child will never learn to feed him or herself. The child will never learn how to walk on his or her own two legs. The child will always be dependent on that feeling of closeness and connection with that mother. What that child needs to learn is that mom is there for me all the time, even if I don't feel her, even if I don't sense her presence right there. And that's what God has to do for you and me as well. He has to wean us off of our reliance on our emotions and the good things that he brings to us, so that we would learn to trust him as God, regardless of how I feel on any given day. And so that season that you're in might feel dry or discouraging, but God is doing some of his most important work in you, even if you don't see it or feel it. C.S. Lewis wrote a masterful little book called The Screwtape Letters. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to pick it up. But he imagines letters being written between two demons who are trying to draw this Christian away from the life of faith. And early on, this Christian, he becomes a follower of Jesus, and there's joy, and there's celebration, and there's intimacy, and these demons are trying to figure out, what do we do with this? And so Wormwood is the name of the amateur demon who writes letters to Screwtape, who's the expert demon. It's kind of a weird story, but hey, it works. But this inexperienced demon is explaining to Screwtape how he is excited because this Christian is now going through a dry period, a trough, as he calls it. And this is what Screwtape writes to him. So you got to pay attention because it's a little bit backwards. It sounds inverse, but here's what he says. God will set them off with communications of his presence, which, though faint, seem great to them, with emotional sweetness and easy conquest over temptation. But he never allows this state of affairs to last long. Sooner or later, he withdraws, if not in fact, at least from their conscious experience, all those support and incentives. He leaves the creature to stand up on its own legs, to carry out from the will alone duties which have lost all relish. It is during those trough periods, much more than during the peak periods, that it is growing into the sort of creature he wants it to be. Hence, the prayers offered in the state of dryness are those which please him best. He wants them to learn to walk and must therefore take away his hand. And if only the will to walk is really there, he is pleased even with their stumbles. Do not be deceived, Wormwood. Our cause is never more in danger than when a human, no longer desiring but still intending to do our enemy's will, looks round upon a universe from which every trace of him seems to have vanished, asks why he has been forsaken, and still obeys. That is what it means to trust God completely. Even if you don't feel it, even if you don't see it, to still follow him. You might be in that season today. Maybe you've been in that season for a while. I've been in a season like this for a little while. Man, it's hard. It's not easy. It's not clear. You don't always know what God is doing. And it seems like, okay, I'm doing the right things. God should be providing. He should be coming through. And it just seems like sometimes you're like, is God off somewhere else? Is he helping someone else out? Is he bringing blessings somewhere else? And what God is doing is he's purifying us to trust him completely. As Jesus said, he said, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. And this is what we see happen in Abraham's story. You look at verse 14. So Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. The word there for provided also sounds like the word for vision. On the mountain of the Lord he will be seen. You see, when we offer everything to God, when he is our hope, when he is what we are clinging to, that is when we see him completely. That is when we know that he is good, that he is enough, that he is all that I need. When I give him everything, that is when I see him clearly. That is when I trust him completely. I can only know that God is all that I need when he is all that I have. And so when I open up my hands to him, when I open up my life to him, when I open up my emotions to him, when I open up my circumstances to him and say, whatever you want to lead me through, God, it's okay. Whatever difficulty I'm in right now, I trust you. Whatever darkness I feel towards you right now, I know that you are God and I am not, and so I will continue to follow you through this season, even if I don't see it, and even if I don't feel like it. That is when God is doing his most important work in us. The Lord will provide. He will be seen. And many commentators and many historians believe that this mountain where Abraham experienced that vision of God also later is known as the mountain of Calvary. We're on the mountain of the Lord. The love of God, the provision of God is seen for us most clearly in that he offered his son, Jesus, for us. That if Abraham loved his son and gave him up, and God says, I know that you trust me, how much more so do we as people who know the God who is the Father of Jesus? Can we trust him to provide? Trust him to be good. Tim Keller put it this way. God saw Abraham's sacrifice and said, now I know that you love me because you did not withhold your only son from me. But how much more can we look at his sacrifice on the cross and say to God, now we know that you love us, for you did not withhold your son, your only son whom you love from us. When the magnitude of what he did dawns on us, it makes it possible to finally rest our hearts in him rather than anything else. See, this is where we cling to God and what he has done for us in and through the person of Jesus. And this week, as we walk through the story of Jesus, we're gonna see, what did Christ say on the cross? He said on the one hand, my God, why have you forsaken me? And yet he also said, into your hands I commit my spirit. He trusted his Father completely. And so we know on the mountain of the Lord will be provided. On the mountain of Calvary, it was provided for us. And so if we have Christ, we have all that we need. No matter what my circumstances, no matter what my feelings, no matter what I'm going through, if I have Christ, I don't need anything else because God has provided for me all that I need. The writer of Hebrews put it this way. He said, God disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained in it. What God is doing at this stage is he's growing you to be a person who trusts him completely. And so what does that mean for you this morning? Some of you, you're not in this stage right now, and this has been a really discouraging talk. Just know right? That in the journey of faith, there are going to be seasons of dryness, seasons of difficulty, seasons where God is confusing. That does not mean that he has left you or abandoned you. It means he's doing a deeper work in you. Some of you are here this morning and you've been in this, and so you know exactly what I'm talking about this morning. Know that God is working even if you don't feel it. And that what he wants you to be able to say, and what he is working out in you so that you would be able to declare is that all I need is Jesus. And that if he is all that I need, then I have all that I have. This past week, there's a hymn that's been rolling in the back of my mind. It's a hymn that we sang a lot in church growing up. And it says, there's 5 simple words. Christ is all I need. Christ is all I need. All I need. Can you say that this morning? That's what God wants to lead you to be able to declare that. And so I asked Justin if he would lead us through this hymn as we close, to just say to our hearts and to our minds, to our bodies, if you're in this season, Christ is all that I need. If you're not in this season, you're heading towards that season, Christ is all that you need. And so let's say that together this morning.
Christ is all I need. Christ is all I need. All I need. Christ is all I need. Christ is all I need. All I need. Again, Christ. Christ is all I need. Christ is all I need. All I need. Christ is all I need. Christ is all I